By 1857, central Alabama's cotton country ran like a killing floor disguised as countryside. Pale rows of cotton stretched across iron-red clay until they sloped into soggy lowlands, where cypress roots drank stagnant water, and morning fog lay so heavy it felt like the land itself was breathing out spirits. The plantation called Hollow Creek sat on the knife edge between ruthless productivity and forgotten wilderness. The main house and the gin stood on the highest rise, where white eyes could scan every acre they claimed. The slave cabins sagged closer to the boggy bottoms, where rain carved ruts into paths worn thin by bare feet, traveling the same routes for generations. Beyond the final cabin sprawled a strip of half-wild swamp the owner's books dismissed as useless. But the enslaved knew better. They believed the ground remembered everything that touched it, every drop of blood and sweat, every body hurried into shallow soil when burying with care took longer than an overseer thought a dead person was worth. If stories of hoodoo and the walking dead pull at you, if you want to follow a man declared dead by law, dumped in Alabama earth by his enemies, who clawed his way back to haunt the men who buried him, then like this video now. Subscribe so you don't miss the next tale of resistance and supernatural revenge. And comment where you're watching from. Because the terror born on these plantations never stayed trapped in one place, one century, or one history book that tried to erase it. In the master's ledger, leather-bound, reeking of tobacco and old money, he was listed as inventory, Jonah. Approximately 32 years old, field hand, Tennessee-born, purchased at Montgomery auction, sound of body and limb, valued at $900. The entry captured his price, not his person. In the quarters, names meant something deeper than ink. The youngest children called him Old Bones, thinking he couldn't hear. He was all angles and joints, as if years of hunger and labor had burned away everything soft. The elders, the ones who read the land the way preachers read scripture, said Jonah listened to dirt in ways that weren't natural. More than once he'd pause at a fresh, shameful grave, someone buried too quickly after fever, exhaustion, or a beating that went too far. He'd grow quiet, then murmur that the body beneath wasn't resting right. And days later, sickness would spread through the dead person's family, accidents would gather around the gravesite, or a heavy wrongness would settle so thick even hard men avoided the place. Jonah never asked for those gifts. His mother had carried the real knowledge. Back in Tennessee, under another master whose face Jonah could no longer clearly remember, she'd been the one people sought when sickness went beyond what white doctors cared to treat, or when an overseer needed fixing in ways no human court could trace. Jonah learned by accident, peering through cabin wall cracks, while his mother tied knotted strings and whispered words from across the ocean, languages born before chains. He memorized the way she gathered roots at certain hours, how she asked trees for permission before taking bark. When he was sold south at 15, still strong enough to fetch a high price, he chose to bury that knowledge with everything else from his childhood. He told himself survival meant silence, obedience, and bleeding fingers in cotton rows, nothing more. But Hollow Creek had other plans. Death came so often it lost its drama. It became just another texture of the land, like heat or insects whining in swamp grass. One day the gin ripped a man's arm into its gears. 3 more died trying to stop it. Summer fevers swallowed the young and the old alike when the water turned green and foul. Punishments crossed invisible lines into murder, but the law didn't call it murder if the dead were property. Bodies stacked up in the burial ground behind the backfield, too wet for cotton, apparently perfect for the discarded dead. Graves were shallow, markers non-existent, rituals rushed or skipped. Taking time to mourn meant acknowledging humanity. And in soil soaked with unmarked death, Jonah's buried knowledge began clawing its way back. The dreams came first, those fragile hours before dawn when spirits were said to listen. Jonah would find himself standing in the graveyard while his body lay on a wooden pallet. The earth would split open, not slowly, but violently. The dead climbed part way out, not rotted or skeletal, but whole, just as they'd looked in life. Only the eyes were different, burning with unspent fury. They never spoke. But the question pressed against him without sound. Are you going to let this stand? He woke choking on red clay that had no earthly reason to be in his mouth. The breaking point came one October night. Mother Ada, whatever name white folks had once written down no longer mattered, caught him behind the woodshed and pushed a cloth bundle into his trembling hand. Inside were impossible things: dried roots, something sharp like a tooth, rusted metal, and soil darker and heavier than any earth on the plantation. "You're already carrying half the work inside you," she said. "The rest is coming whether you want it or not. Better you learn to steer it before it breaks you." Jonah tried to give it back. He spoke of the whip, of chains, of not wanting more suffering. Mother Ada laughed, short and bitter. "You think trouble waits for permission here? This ain't about making things worse. This is about giving you a knife in a world where everybody else already carries guns." The lessons began in stolen moments before dawn. She taught him the right hours to approach graves, how to ask permission before taking dirt, how soil from the innocent carried different power than soil from the violently dead, how crossroads weren't all sacred, but some, if awakened correctly, opened doors between worlds, coins arranged just so, dirt scattered in precise lines, words that were part English, part African memory, part something older than names. Jonah learned with the focus of a man who understood this might be his only weapon. At first, he tested it small. An especially cruel overseer tripped in the same spot 3 mornings in a row, snapping boot heels clean off on perfectly flat ground. When he bought new boots, he fell again, this time twisting his ankle badly enough to limp for a month. No root, no hole, no explanation. But people noticed. Then the dogs changed. One hunting dog in particular, Devil, a mean-spirited brute famous for catching runaways, suddenly refused the scent one morning. It howled like it saw something no one else could. And that was only the beginning. The change showed first in the dogs. Without warning, Devil refused to go anywhere near the stretch of woods where Jonah gathered roots under Mother Ada's guidance. He would charge confidently toward the tree line, then suddenly stop short, planting his paws as if he'd slammed into an invisible wall. No matter how hard the handler yanked the chain or how violently he cursed, the dog would not move. When forced closer, Devil began to shake, low whines tearing from his throat, hackles standing straight up, eyes rolling white with terror fixed on something the man at the other end of the leash couldn't see. After 3 attempts that nearly strangled the animal as it tried to retreat, the handler finally gave up and declared the dog off. Within a week, 2 more dogs reacted the same way at the very same spot. The overseer blamed snakes, maybe a panther, explanations that satisfied white reason, but no one in the quarters believed. The truth was simpler and stranger. Jonah had drawn a line there, a boundary written in signs only the sharpest senses could read. Those woods no longer belonged to human hunters. Other lines followed, quiet, invisible borders only the knowing could feel. At one crossroads, where the path from the cabins met the track to the cotton fields, horses began to shy and sidestep for no clear reason. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent refusal to cross at exactly one angle, small enough to dismiss, disruptive enough to matter. Jonah wasn't trying to burn the plantation down. He knew open rebellion would bring swift and catastrophic punishment, not just on him, but on everyone linked to him. What he created instead were pockets of uncertainty inside a machine built on absolute control, tiny malfunctions in the engine of oppression, just enough friction to make the overseers work harder and the enslaved breathe a little easier. Then the escape shattered the balance. 4 people decided Hollow Creek had taken all it ever would from them. 3 men from the gin. 1 woman whose sister had been sold south just days before. They chose a moonless October night, dark enough to swallow footprints, thick enough, with brush to hide movement, the nearby swamp passable if you knew where not to sink. Word reached Jonah by glances and unfinished sentences, the quarter's silent language. The question hovered unspoken. Can you help? Can you delay the dogs? Give us hours. Jonah hesitated. That pause would haunt him longer than any scream. He wanted them free, wanted the fields empty, wanted the master staring at useless land. But he also understood the mathematics of punishment. If this escape succeeded through unseen means, white men would come with preachers, conjure breakers, and specialists in tearing spiritual work apart. And if Jonah was exposed, they wouldn't just kill him. They would make a spectacle so painful it would terrify 2 generations into never seeking that kind of help again. So he stayed silent, told himself he would help the next group, called caution wisdom instead of fear. The 4 slipped away just after midnight. No bags, no bundles, only what fit in their pockets. By dawn, they were gone. By full morning, the hunt was underway with brutal efficiency. Crawford led it himself. Crawford, who took pleasure in pain, 3 dogs, 2 hired trackers, 4 armed white men. They rode out before the dew dried, promising to return with the runaways dead or begging for it. The hunt lasted 2 days. Jonah worked the fields with everyone else, hands moving on cotton by muscle memory, while his ears tracked the distant baying that drifted in on the wind. When it grew louder, his stomach clenched. They were close. When it turned frantic and tight, he knew someone had been cornered. By the second evening, the sound stopped. The silence was worse. They brought the bodies back at dawn on a wagon, stacked like firewood. Crawford ordered everyone into the yard. The 4 were laid out in a row, 2 shot, 2 torn by dogs, and finished with bullets. Flesh opened, clothing shredded, a deliberate lesson. The master watched from the porch, arms folded, expression empty of both joy and regret. "Let this be a lesson," Crawford announced. "Running is just dying slow." They were buried together in one shallow pit. No coffins, no markers. A single grave scraped out just deep enough to hide the evidence. That night, Jonah couldn't stay on his pallet. While the quarters slept, he slipped into a darkness that felt heavier than usual, as if the night itself waited. His feet carried him to the fresh grave, without his eyes guiding the way. The disturbed earth swallowed what little starlight existed. 4 lives reduced to an 8x4 patch of soil. He knelt, then he pressed his palms down. What answered him was not voice but force, rage, grief, fury, and beneath it all a single demand that bypassed speech entirely. Fix this. Make it mean something. Turn what they did to us into a weapon. Jonah whispered his fear into the dirt. The cost, the danger, the hell it might bring on everyone. The ground went cold beneath his hands. Not night cold, but grave cold. The chill climbed into his chest until he couldn't tell where his heartbeat ended and the dead began. They did not promise safety. They only promised presence. "All right," he said at last. "We'll do it together. But when they try to bury me, and they will, you pull me back." The earth trembled, just a fraction. Agreement. By dawn, dogs would refuse the backfield. By midweek, Crawford would wake, choking on invisible dirt. By month's end, Hollow Creek would know control had cracked. Jonah had less than 3 months left. But for the first time, he had stopped trying to survive by shrinking, and had chosen to fight with the only weapons left to him, the angry dead, the forbidden knowledge, and the willingness to walk the narrow space between life and the grave. Whatever Mother Ada worked on in the evenings, no one ever glimpsed it clearly. When younger women dared to ask, she would flash a grin too wide for comfort and say only, "Insurance." No one pressed her. In the quarters, people understood that some questions carried answers too heavy to live with. On the fourth morning, a field hand named Samuel, a steady, practical man in his 40s who'd never once drawn trouble, was sent to stake out a new planting row near the edge of the burial ground. He measured the distance with his string and mallet, just as Crawford ordered, then stopped so abruptly he nearly dropped both. "Boss," he called, his voice tight, "you need to see this." Crawford rode over, irritation already sharpening his face. Samuel pointed. Jonah's grave, packed down flat and solid only days before, had split straight down the middle. Not the crooked settling you'd expect from shifting clay. This crack was clean, deliberate, as if something beneath had pushed upward and then hesitated. Worse still, the dirt around it looked worked over, churned instead of smoothed by time and rain. 10 shallow pits marked the surface, finger-shaped impressions pressed into soft clay. "Root did it," Crawford said too fast. "Or a dog." "No roots run that straight," Samuel said quietly. "And no dog's been back here. You've seen how they act." Crawford dismounted and crouched near the mound without touching it. The wrongness of it prickled his skin, despite the thick heat. "Fill it in," he snapped, rising quickly. "Pack it harder this time. Spread gravel on top." Samuel obeyed, though his hands trembled on the first shovel stroke. As he filled the lie, he felt resistance, faint but real, like the earth itself was pushing back. By midday, the grave lay flat again, under a scatter of pale stones that looked less like a burial and more like a warning. That night, the dead did not stay dead. If hoodoo and resurrection stir something in you, if you believe power doesn't always die with the body, then like this video, subscribe and share these stories so they don't get buried again. Comment where you're watching from, because both terror and hope travel farther than chains ever could. Jacob, one of the young men forced to dig Jonah's grave, woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps dragging past his cabin. Slow, uneven, as if the walker's legs no longer bent the way they once had. He lay frozen, heart battering his ribs. The steps stopped outside his door. A shadow slid across the gap beneath it, too tall, too thin. Then a voice scraped through the wood, dry as dirt in a throat, with no spit left in it. "You dug deep, boy. Took me a while to climb back out." Jacob didn't breathe again until the steps moved on. By morning, he told himself it was a dream, until Elijah, 3 cabins down, described the same shadow, the same voice. By week's end, the sightings multiplied. A woman fetching water before dawn saw a figure standing motionless at the edge of the burial ground, black against the tree line. She blinked, and it was gone. 2 children swore they saw a man walk straight into the tool shed wall and vanish as if the wood was smoke. An overseer's horse reared violently on an empty path, nearly throwing its rider while staring at nothing anyone else could see. Crawford called it hysteria, superstition feeding on fear. But when he checked the grave again, the stones were gone. Not scattered, removed. The crack had returned, wider now. When he knelt and held his breath, he heard movement beneath the soil, not roots, not insects, but cloth dragging over clay, and breath. He ordered the grave refilled once more, this time with lime mixed into the dirt and a wooden cross driven into the mound, as if faith might succeed where weight had failed. The cross lasted 2 nights. They found it snapped neatly at the base, the pieces laid side by side, as if by hands making a point. Meanwhile, Jonah was learning what he had become. He was not alive in any way doctors or preachers would understand. His heart only beat when he remembered to make it. He breathed only to speak, and even then the air tasted of rust and old earth. His joints remembered the grave and moved with stiff, jerking missteps. Dirt never left his skin. It lived beneath his nails, in every crease, a permanent reminder of where he'd been. But he could move. He could see, though colour looked muted, as if the world were submerged. And most importantly, he could cross the boundary between the living and the dead, like a door left slightly ajar. The dead spoke to him constantly, not in words, but in pressure and urgency, in old anger rising like swamp gas. The 4 runaways stayed closest, pacing beside him in the night. They wanted Crawford, not injured, not punished, undone. Jonah began with whispers. Crawford saw him in the edges of his vision. Footprints appeared on the roof of the tool shed and across bare yard, where no one had walked. His name floated on the air when no wind stirred. Sleep deserted him in pieces. He woke, choking, lost weight. His hands developed a tremor he couldn't hide. Even the whip felt uncertain in his grip. The doctor found nothing wrong. Prescribed rest and medicine. The medicine only sharpened Crawford's dreams, dirt pouring into his mouth, while the voices of dead slaves laughed and told him, "Now you know." Mother Ada watched with quiet satisfaction. She had known Jonah wouldn't stay buried. What she hadn't known was whether he would return as himself, or as something wearing his shape. The answer came slowly. Jonah still helped the quarter. He guarded sick children. He guided those planning escape. He turned fevers away and whispered safe route paths into dreams. But toward the men who buried him, he showed no mercy. One man's hands swelled and locked until he couldn't work. Another went blind in one eye, as if packed with dirt that never washed clean. The master felt watched on land he'd once ruled without fear. And Crawford unravelled fastest. Within 2 weeks, he was muttering to himself in daylight, flinching from shadows. No longer the swaggering terror of Hollow Creek, but a man being hunted by things no whip could strike. The master tried doctors, stronger medicine, a replacement overseer. The replacement lasted 3 days. Finally, the master sent for a preacher. The preacher lasted 1 night. At midnight he heard dragging footsteps in the hall and the wet sound of cloth being wrung out. When he opened the door, the hall stood empty. But muddy barefoot prints ran from the front entrance, up the stairs, down the corridor, and stopped directly outside the parlour where he'd been praying. Dark stains mottled the mud. The preacher packed before dawn. He refused payment. "Some places," he said, "are beyond my authority. Tell that man to make peace with the dead, while he still draws breath." The master laughed it off as superstition. Just another tale to keep frightened people in line. But alone at night, with the house silent and every floorboard sounding too loud beneath his steps, even he began to wonder if the whispers carried weight. If Jonah had truly come back and was settling his debts slowly, with intention. The answer came on a night so dark, the moon might as well have been buried too. 3 weeks after the grave had been filled, Crawford, hollow-eyed from sleeplessness, took to wandering the edges of the plantation with a lantern in one hand and a loaded pistol in the other, as if circling the land could keep whatever stalked him from crossing an invisible line. He skirted the burial ground by instinct now, keeping wide of that disturbed clay, and headed toward the swamp, where the ordered fields broke apart into shadow and wild growth. That was where Jonah stepped out of the trees and into the lantern's yellow ring. He stood as solid as he ever had in life, same height, same shoulders, but dirt still clung to his clothes and skin, packed beneath his nails, smeared along his jaw, and his eyes caught the light wrong, not with human reflection, with the flat gleam of an animal caught on a dark road. Crawford raised the pistol on pure reflex. His hands shook so badly, the barrel drew frantic circles in the air. "You're dead," he stammered. I watched them fill you in. I stamped the dirt myself." "You did," Jonah said. His voice sounded scraped raw, as if his throat had forgotten how speech worked and had to remember it again. "And it took me 3 days to claw back out. 3 days digging through clay with bare hands while my lungs were full of it, every part of me begging to stay buried. But I made promises before you put me under. And the dead don't break promises just because dying is inconvenient." Crawford fired. The shot burst across the swamp, shattering the quiet. Birds screamed up from the trees. The bullet struck Jonah square in the chest. The cloth tore. Jonah rocked back half a step. And nothing else happened. No blood, no collapse, no death spasm Crawford had seen so many times before. Jonah glanced down at the hole in his shirt, then back up. His face held something like pity, ruined by contempt. "Can't kill what's already paid that cost," he said, stepping forward. Crawford stumbled backward, tripped over his own boots, and crashed to the ground. The lantern flew from his hand, spinning into the grass and throwing crazed shadows. From below, Jonah looked impossibly tall, framed against cold, distant stars that offered no mercy. "The 4 you hunted down," Jonah continued, and now his voice carried undertones, as if others spoke beneath his words. "They want to know why their lives mattered less than your pride. The woman you whipped until she lost her child, she's waiting to see when you learn what that kind of loss does to a soul. And all the ones dumped in shallow ground with no names and no prayers. They're asking when you're going to answer for that." Crawford tried to crawl away, hands tearing at dirt, mouth opening and closing without sound. Jonah crouched close. The overseer smelled him then, not rot but damp earth, old soil thick with slow decay. "I could stop your heart right now," Jonah said calmly. "My hands remember what death feels like. They know how to give it too. But they don't want you quick. They want you awake for it, haunted until you can't tell sleep from dying, until every breath feels borrowed." Jonah stood, stepped over him like he was nothing but debris, and walked back toward the swamp. Before the trees swallowed him, he spoke once more. "Every night you have left, I'll be there when you close your eyes. Every shadow, every sound you can't place, that'll be me, or them, or what you did finally catching up. You tried to make an example of me. Congratulations. Now everyone's going to watch what happens when a man tries to bury someone the dead have claimed." Crawford lay in the dirt for more than an hour, uninjured, but emptied by terror so complete his body had forgotten how to move. When he finally dragged himself back to his cabin, he muttered prayers and curses and broken apologies to faces he hadn't thought of in years. By morning, the plantation knew. Crawford wouldn't give details, only ranted about a walking witch and bullets that didn't work. Among the enslaved, the reaction split clean. The ones who had felt his cruelty most deeply tasted grim satisfaction. Others, especially the elders who survived by avoiding notice, feared retaliation. When they went to Mother Ada, she only shook her head. "This ain't about blame anymore," she said. "The ground's talking now. That boy opened a door when he went under. What's coming through don't belong to anyone to command. Best we do is stay out the way." She was right. Within a month, Crawford was finished. He wouldn't leave his cabin, convinced Jonah and the dead waited the moment he stepped outside. Doctors failed him. Preachers failed him. At last the master, angry over wasted money and a crippled workforce, cast him out with a horse and a few coins and ordered him never to return. At dawn, the day Crawford rode away, Jonah stood at the edge of the burial ground. The 4 runaways stood with him, unseen by the living, but close enough to make the morning feel strangely light. It wasn't the revenge they might have chosen, but it was something. Crawford made it nearly 3 counties before his horse threw him into a ravine during a storm. They found his body a week later, mud packed into his mouth and nose, as if he'd tried to breathe underground. Official cause: accident. The men who retrieved him swore he looked like someone who knew he was being buried alive again. At Hollow Creek, no one celebrated, no one mourned. But that night, the quarters filled with an old song, older than English, half prayer, half thanks. Jonah faded back into the space between worlds. Runaways found directions in dreams. Sick children healed too fast to explain. Travelers met a man at crossroads after dark, who told them which paths led to life and which did not. The crack in the burial ground never closed. The legend spread of the man buried for hoodoo who clawed his way back, of the dead as allies, of the earth as a weapon, of power that didn't only travel through law and whip and chain. For 7 years after Crawford's exile and drowning, Hollow Creek rotted from the inside. Overseers came and left. Graves refused to stay quiet. Escape became common. And somewhere between breath and burial, Jonah kept walking the boundary, proof that some doors, once forced open by rage and righteousness, never truly shut again. With every retelling, Jonah's story grew larger than life. Some swore he could pass through walls. Others claimed he vanished at will, stepping in and out of sight like smoke. A few whispered that he had bargained with the devil, himself, trading his soul for the power to punish slavers and shield runaways. The truth beneath all the embellishment was stranger and far simpler. Jonah had died and returned. He had turned his own body into a passage between worlds. And through that passage moved a kind of justice no court would ever recognize, but one deeply understood by people who knew that resistance wore many faces, and that sometimes the greatest weapon was refusing to stay buried when burial was meant to erase you forever. Mother Ada passed in the winter of 1862. She died quietly in her sleep, at an age no one could name, because no one had ever been allowed to record it. That same night, Jonah appeared at her bedside, visible only to her. They spoke for hours in the blended language she had taught him, part English, part African memory, part something older than both. She told him she was proud, that the cost had been terrible, yes, but the purpose had been true, and she promised she would see him again in the place where accounts were finally balanced, where no one owned anyone ever again. When they found her at dawn, her face was peaceful in a way few had ever seen on it. Even those who had known her as hard and unyielding whispered that she must have been greeting something beautiful at the end. Jonah felt her leaving like a door closing inside his chest. She had been his anchor, his teacher, his compass, the one who taught him how to turn knowledge into a shield and pain into a weapon. Without her, he felt unmoored, not because he walked between life and death, but because he was still human enough to need connection. So he began to travel. He left Hollow Creek more often. He moved along the hidden routes runaways followed, across Alabama and into neighboring states. Wherever people fled, he went ahead of them, leaving protections behind, like invisible signposts. Dreams guided the lost. Pursuers grew confused. Paths folded safely inward. Then the war arrived. When the Union pushed south, freedom came with boots and rifles and written orders instead of route work and whispers. Jonah watched tens of thousands run openly toward the lines. Plantations emptied in days. What he had fought and died to protect was unfolding on a scale he had never imagined. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt bittersweet. Freedom through law was still freedom. He knew that. But some part of him, the part forged in the earth and shaped by spirits older than the nation itself, grieved the passing of a different kind of power, the power of the powerless to bend reality when no other path existed. As the war dragged toward its end and slavery's legal bones began to fracture, the pull of the grave grew stronger, no longer a threat, an invitation. His bargain had never been permanent. He had borrowed time to protect, to balance accounts, and now the work was thinning. Reconstruction would follow. His role would become symbol instead of necessity. One spring night in 1864, Jonah returned to Hollow Creek for the last time. The plantation stood nearly empty. The master had fled months earlier, with whatever he could carry. Only the sick, the old, and the waiting remained. Jonah walked the quarters once more, brushing his fingers across cabin walls where laughter, sorrow, and learning had once lived. He went to the burial ground and stood at the long-standing crack in the clay. It had never fully closed. He knelt and pressed his palms to the earth. "The law's going to say it's over," he told them, "but law don't heal hearts, and hearts that learn to own people don't forget cruelty just because they lost the paper that said they could. I did what I promised. I turned their weapon back on them. I made the ground answer when they thought they ruled it. I helped folks get free when no one else would." The cold climbed into his hands. "If that's enough," he whispered, "I'm ready to come home, and if it ain't, then I'll keep walking between worlds until it is." The ground answered, not with words, but with understanding, fear planted in the violent, hope restored to the broken, proof given that death did not always mean the end. You paid, we are satisfied. Others will carry what you began. Jonah stood. He lifted his eyes to the Alabama sky one final time, the same stars he had watched for 7 years through Dead Man's sight, and stepped into the crack. This time he did not fight. The earth closed around him gently. No panic, no struggle, only the deep quiet of return. The soil sealed itself smooth above him, hands from below drawing the clay shut. By morning, the ground looked ordinary. Only the weight beneath it remained. But legend does not seal the way graves do. For decades afterward, Jonah's story traveled through quarters, churches, kitchens, and back roads. The details changed. Some made him a hero, some made him a monster, but the core remained. He was buried for knowing forbidden things. He clawed back after 3 days underground. He broke the overseer who killed him, and when his work was done, he chose when and how to rest. To some, it was a ghost story. To others, it was instruction. It taught that power was not owned only by those with whips and laws, that ancestors still listened, that the ground remembered, that even a grave could be turned into a weapon. And when people said later that Alabama clay could not hold a man who had made a pact with the restless dead, they were not speaking only of Jonah. They were speaking of all who refused to be erased. If this story of hoodoo and resurrection, of turning burial into resistance and death into defiance, stirred something in you, then remember it, share it, speak it. Because legends like Jonah's exist for one reason: to remind the living that silence is not submission, and that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is rising after the world is certain you are gone.